All right. Well, aloha, everyone. Uh, Imagine yourselves going on a tour of, say, North Korea, and then President Trump imposed military rule, arrested political opponents, including student activists and professors like you, blacklisted others they could not find, and so abruptly you could no longer go back to Hawaii for fear of getting arrested. You're stranded in Pyongyang. That's what happened to me 50 years ago, except it was not Pyongyang, but Beijing. So let me take you on a journey through China using 20 objects as markers of what I've done and experienced. Now, these are not mere objects, these are stories of people. Okay. So my journey begins in 1971. I first visited China with a group of Filipino youth for a 3 week tour, and incredibly, 3 weeks abruptly turned into a 50-year of stay in China, a forced exile in China. Now, China then was a forbidden place, forbidden city of sorts. It was poor, weak, and isolated, kind of North Korea today. It was illegal for Filipinos to travel there. And in fact, our Philippine passports were stamped with a declaration not valid for travel to China, the Soviet Union, and other communist countries. But the official warnings did not stop us. We took a plane to Hong Kong where we picked up our Chinese visas. Destination, China. With this passport, on August 21, I and my group took a train from Hong Kong to Shenzhen, stopped over in Guangzhou, and then flew to Beijing same day. 15 of us, student leaders, young academics and professionals, including a Benedictine monk and a Muslim youth leader, we traveled to China, hosted by the China Friendship Association. We went there. Why? Because we were curious to see for ourselves the so-called Red China. So here I am wearing long hair and tight pants. I was 20 and a big fan of the Beatles and Bob Dylan. At home, we were branded as radicals or pinkos because we openly criticized President Marcos. We organized protests against him and against the Vietnam War. Well, China then was, in the throes of the Cultural Revolution, which began in 1966 and ended in 1976. So we were there midway through the Cultural Revolution, and the slogan was, "Never forget class struggle." Chairman Mao then was worshipped as a demigod, his little red book used like a Bible. It's a long story, but just a week after our China trip, a bombing incident back home was followed by arrests of hundreds of President Marcos's political opponents, including student activists and youth leaders like us. So we were not sure about going back. Our hosts renewed our visas to give us time to figure out what to do. In fact, our visas then, you see them here, were not stamped on our passports, but were stamped on pieces of paper like this to give us deniability. But in the end, 5 of us had to stay in China indefinitely. So stranded in an alien place, we asked our host, how about if we work and earn our keep? Well, they suggested that we go to the countryside, just as many young Chinese had done. We agreed, even though we knew it could be hard. "You're going to Hunan," our host said, and we were excited. We looked at the map and figured that the climate in Hunan must be more mild because it was south of cold Beijing. We were wrong. When we arrived in the Hunan State Farm in late December 71, it was snowing ferociously. Well, we worked with farmers planting and harvesting rice, picking tea leaves, and digging ditches. Life was tough, but we fired ourselves with the romantic notion that we were getting a close up look at life in Chinese countryside. Well, the romance wore off quickly. After sweating in the fields, there was little else to do, and we were terribly, terribly homesick. By the end of 1972, our time at the state farm was up, and so we were transferred to the a to the a fishing corporation in Yentai, Shandong province. Now Yentai, and I still have my work clothes with me at that time. Yentai was a charming and underdeveloped city, but it was also very cold. We would sail on trawler ships for 5 to 7 days at a turn to catch seafood. After work, we anchored in the high seas and would have nothing else to do except talk, play cards, and sleep. While others slept, I read voraciously to improve my Chinese. It was a tedious exercise, but it paid off later. So those were crazy, crazy years. There were Mao pins, Mao portraits, Mao quotations. Wherever I turned, it was Mao, Mao everywhere. But spring came in 1977. Chairman Mao died a year earlier, and Deng Xiaoping quickly started his reform and opening up. But who would execute his reform? Deng Xiaoping realized they needed a generation of well-educated, competent talents. So in late 1976, China restored the so-called Gaokao, the national college entrance exams, which had been suspended for 10 years. In 1977, China enrolled the first batch of college students who got in through competitive exams and not for ideological or political reliability. Some 5.7 million youths took the exams, and less than 800,000 got in. Now, I was fortunate to enroll at Peking University to do a 4-year course in Chinese history together with this class of 1977. It's an illustrious group. Alumni include Premier Li Keqiang. There's Wang Juntao, a prodigy turned dissident who's now on political exile in New Jersey. And there's Bo Xilai, the former Chongqing party chief and Politburo member who is now in jail. Bo and I were in the same class. Now, one of the highlights of my 4-year stay at Peking University was my time playing in the varsity basketball team. We won the All Beijing Championship in spring of 1979. And in the summer of 1979, we went to Chengdu to represent Beijing in the national kind of basketball championship, like the NCAA. And we played well. We got into the semifinals, and we came home with this banner. My teammates gave me the privilege of keeping this team banner, which I still have all framed here. I covered the so-called Deng Xiaoping's second revolution from 1982 to 2000. That's how we at Time Magazine called it, the second revolution. The Chinese call it reform and opening up. Now, in the initial years, opening up literally meant opening closed cities and towns. When I first arrived in China, most places were off limits to foreigners. But in March 1991, the Foreign Ministry sent out a document to Beijing based correspondents, providing us with an updated list of newly opened places. All told, 733 cities and counties made the list. That's 733 of some 4,000 Chinese cities and counties nationwide. So it was glass half full. Now, other sectors started to open up too. And one of the best things living and working in China is you get to meet a lot of interesting and smart people. Among them, Mr. Ying Cheng, the actor, director, playwright, translator, and at one time, a vice minister of culture, fluent in English and a master of Chinese language and literature. Ying is best known outside China for his role as the jail warden in Bertolucci's film, The Last Emperor. But to me, he is best remembered for translating Death of a Salesman, and in 1983, for inviting Arthur Miller to Beijing and co-direct the Chinese production of the play. Ying himself played the role of Willy Loman, and the play was staged to enthusiastic audiences for 3 months. Now, dance parties, once banned as a form of bourgeois decadence, in 1979 grew in popularity even in campuses. The cafeterias in Peking University became dance floors at night. We students waltzed and tangoed to music coming out of a boombox. But what about this newfangled Western thing called disco or disco? Few people knew, and I was expected to teach my curious Chinese friends. Now, luckily, one Chinese agency published a booklet that offers some method and illustrated steps to what I thought was a totally freewheeling dance. Now, this is an oil on paper painting by Yan Li, who later emigrated to the US. This is a portrait of his ex-girlfriend, Li Shuang, who later got caught in the middle of the so-called Li Shuang incident. Li was one of the founders of the Xingxing, or the Stars, a group of avant-garde artists who challenged the strict tenets of traditional Chinese culture and politics. Now, Li was arrested after she began living with a French diplomat who was separated from his wife and lived alone. She was sentenced to 2 years of re-education through labor. Her case created a diplomatic tension between France and China, and later the two sides agreed she was released and allowed to emigrate to France, where she still lives. Now, her story highlights the Chinese puritanical taboo against contacts or intermarriage between Chinese citizens and foreigners. It helped end the ban on intermarriage between Chinese and foreigners. Now, opening up has turned China into a huge market, virtually of everything, right? Steel, copper, oil, even cosmetics and junk food. In 1992, Beijing opened its first McDonald's outlet. Food was handed out for free that day to give Beijingers a taste of what they thought was Americana. 40,000 customers packed the store that day, and I still keep this commemorative wristwatch handed out to VIPs and journalists. Now, fast food joints like McDonald's, KFC, and Pizza Hut have largely succeeded doing business in China by slowly making them seem less foreign to Chinese customers, making Chinese families think that eating there no longer is a special occasion, but as routine as eating out for dim sum or jajang noodles. Now, I know a Chinese friend who says his son for years thought that McDonald's was a Chinese fast food because since childhood, he had been dragging his parents to eat at the Golden Arches. Now, of course, there's been a backlash and a crackdown. Opening up was difficult. Uh, Now, in the early 90s, there was a backlash. The arch conservatives in Beijing counterattacked by setting off some movement or campaign against so-called Beijing, like spiritual pollution or bourgeois liberalism. And those are catch-alls for anything that was Western, anything that they disliked. And months later, Deng Xiaoping stopped the ideological campaigns, arguing that when you open the windows, uh, flies and mosquitoes are bound to come in along with the fresh air, and that it was not much to worry about. Now, we bourgeois liberals felt good hearing that. Still, the emergence of anti-spiritual pollution theme revealed factional differences at the top. Leaders debated the vexing contradictions, how to continue China's opening up while remaining loyal to Marxist tenets, or how to get rich while staying Chinese and socialist. That's what I sensed when we covered the 13th Communist Party Congress in 1987, the first time we foreign journalists were allowed in as observers. Now, Rick Hornig and I are in this picture. Now, this remarkable photo was taken on the last day of the party Congress, which was typically choreographed. This time, however, journalists were invited to a cocktail party in which Zhao Ziyang, then 68, was introduced as the new general secretary of the party. And for an hour, he gave off-the-cuff answers to our unfiltered questions. It's a punctuation mark of my 30 years there. Alas, 2 years later, Zhao Ziyang was sacked and became the biggest scapegoat of the bloody suppression of the Tiananmen protests. Now, China's socio-economic and political contradictions came to a boil on Tiananmen Square in 1989. Our Time magazine reporting team covered Tiananmen from beginning to end. And the story, as you know, started as a memorial march honoring Hu Yaobang, a reformist communist leader. Then it evolved into a massive protest and ended into a tragic massacre. I've kept many mementos of Tiananmen 89, but among them is this strip of red cloth ripped from a protest banner and turned into headbands. This one was given by one of the marshals guarding the square in late evening of June 2nd. He said he was determined to stay on, even though we both could sense it may not end well, or it may end badly. And indeed, it ended badly on June 4th. And you may have read many accounts about that. But let me share a backstory. The next morning, I was in Time Magazine's Beijing office finishing up the fact-checking of the Time cover story that we had hastily put together. And then a woman phoned me saying, my friend Ho Dejian, shown here strumming his guitar, was asking if I could pick him up from a nearby hospital where he took refuge overnight. I told her to call me back in 10 minutes. Should I do it? Sure, Ho is a dear friend. He had invited me to live in his spacious apartment for months while I was looking for a permanent housing in Beijing. And yes, as a composer singer, he was a darling of Beijing communist leaders when he defected from Taiwan to the mainland years earlier. But by this time, he had become such a controversial lightning rod since he joined three Beijing intellectuals on a hunger strike in Tiananmen in support of the protesters. Their action boosted the already sagging protest movement and, of course, angered communist officials. He was in Tiananmen the night the PLA troops cleared the square. He must be, I thought, on some wanted list by now. But Ho is a dear friend, so I agreed to pick him up. The streets were deserted, PLA troops had set up checkpoints, and there Ho was standing at the gate of the Capital Hospital, wearing only wearing a white doctor's robe, his only disguise, and in fact, onlookers there recognized him. And there was another man with him, Liu Xiaobo, the other Tiananmen protest leader, who was later awarded posthumously the Nobel Peace Prize. So I told the two, hop in and duck, and drove away gingerly to drop them off to a safe house. 2 years later, when I saw Ho De-jian again in Taipei, he gave me a copy of a cassette tape with his latest composition and songs. And he scribbled a note at the back, which reads, "To Jimmy, the most courageous driver on June 4th, 1989. This, to me, is a keeper. The past 50 years were punctuated with other surprises. Now, who would have thought? When I first interviewed Jiang Zemin in 1987, he had just moved jobs as the mayor of Shanghai. Now, the photographer assigned to take his portrait kept bugging me to convince Jiang to do the interview in his office instead of a boring meeting hall. Now, to our surprise, he agreed, and he posed for us, occasionally speaking to us in conversational English. Years later, in 1999, on the eve of his visit to the US, he gave Time magazine an exclusive interview. By then, he had risen as China's state president and Communist Party chief. So I brought the old picture and I said, "You hardly aged." And he said, "You're like Xiao Didi, younger brother," he said as he autographed the old picture. Another surprise, since the 1980s, China, in fact, has been experimenting with direct elections at the village level, which is China's lowest level of government. Years later, a few villages allowed competitive multi-candidate elections, asking candidates to give speeches and then adopting secret balloting. I observed several of these village elections in North China and South China, a few times accompanied by American political scientists and a Carter Center team from Atlanta. Now, some Chinese advocates of direct election, they tried to push these experiments on higher levels, like the experiment with direct elections in Buyan County in Sichuan province a few years ago. But officials worried about political chaos aborted these experiments. Now, this in the picture is a remnant of a packaging box repurposed as a secret ballot box in a village election that I observed years ago. Alas, it's now a mere political relic. Something more interesting. When Houston Rockets selected the 7'4" Yao Ming as its #1 draft in the year 2002. He came to our CNN Beijing bureau, accompanied by his parents and coach, for live and taped interviews. It was my most neck-breaking assignment. Now, that morning, a photographer snapped this photo on the right of Yao and his parents. And the next day, after the picture was published in the US, Houston Rockets executives phoned me, frantically asking, is Yao Ming sending out a message with the poster hanging on the wall? One of the slogans they noted reads, "Down with US imperialism." So I had to send a formal letter to the Houston Rockets executives to vouch that the poster was part of my collection of vintage posters that had been hanging on our office wall for years, and that Yao, I assure them, had nothing to do with it. On May 7, 1999, 5 US guided bombs struck the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, killing 3 Chinese journalists. President Bill Clinton later apologized, saying it was accidental, but outraged Chinese officials called it a barbarian act. Protests in Beijing, Shanghai, and other cities continued for several days. And in Beijing, I reported that thousands of rock-throwing protesters held up posters like these in the picture. The handwritten one reads, "Down with America." And the printed one below says, "Those who play with fire will burn oneself to death." Now, this is a sobering reminder of how fragile US-China relations can be, that even an accidental act can lead to a scary confrontation. Now, 2 things that happened helped shape my future. 1, going to China and going to school in China. And 2, the opening up of China in 1979. Those 2 together helped shape my career. I have had an incredibly rich experience in China because of those 2 things. I am forever grateful to my Chinese friends for taking me into their lives, however risky and difficult. And I'm grateful to all my mentors at Time and CNN who employed me to watch up close the largest nation in the world in constant state of change. Thank you. I'd be happy to take your questions.